page 7a, and the Gemara that we did yesterday was talking about the law of having how many walls do you need? And there was a machlokes if you need really 3 walls or you need 4 walls. But we did learn that however many you need, the final wall doesn't have to be a full-fledged wall, even a tefach.
Oh, Ken.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes,
So
so maybe you can mute.
Yeah, Robert. Okay, so the third either the third wall or the fourth wall doesn't need to be a full-fledged wall. It could even be a tefach, and the understanding is that that's the halachah l'Moshe Sinai. It's a tradition that final wall doesn't really need to be, doesn't have the same rules as the other walls. We've learned before about the other walls that they have to be 7 handbreadths. We did learn also about Rebbe held that it has to be 4 amos, but 4 cubits. But we held that it's 7 handbreadths is sufficient, and we paskin like Beis Shammai, if you remember, and that's basically the laws of the other 2 walls. But the third wall, or according to Reb Shimon, the fourth wall could even be a tefach, 1 handbreadth. And this, of course, is a very surprising thing that the law of Sukkah has a special law, because according to laws of Shabbos and Eruvin and other things, we don't find such a concept that that a wall, we don't really find that tefach is sufficient. We do have a special law with pasei birois, which we learned about regarding Eruvin using a well, but even there you had 2 sides. You had a tefach on two ends, so it wasn't just one. Here we're having like a third wall, and this wall is a tefach, so it is a special halachah l'Moshe Sinai, special law, and the Gemara goes through the reasons behind the Rabbanon and Shimon, why they hold their way. And we explained yesterday about the fact that the psukim all skip out the extra vavs in the word sukkos. Only one time sukkos does it have a final vav at the in between the chaf and the taf. So the other times it's singular. That one is written out in plural way. And so the Gemara says we can learn from there the amount of walls that you need, and this could be the machlokes between Reb Shimon and the rabbis. Again, we have this machlokes between Reb Shimon and the rabbis. How many walls do you need? Do you need 3 walls or do you need 4 walls? Of course, the last wall doesn't have to be a full-fledged wall, but even then, how many do you need? So somehow the rabbis come up with a calculation of 3 is enough. According to Reb Shimon, it's 4. So the Gemara says maybe it's based on this issue that we find throughout the entire Talmud. We have an issue of, do you follow the log, do you expound on the way something is written, which we call the Mesiras, the way it was handed over, or do we expound on the way that it's pronounced, the way something is pronounced? Maybe that's the way that takes primary. That's the primary way of expounding of learning something out. So maybe that's the source of this machlokes, the Gemara says. The rabbis say yesh aim l'maseiras. They would say that there's primary significance to the way it's written and the way it was handed over, transmitted, and because of that, you would end up with basukos without the vav, and then the final word basukos with the vav. If you add it together, it's 1 + 1 + 2 = 4. So you have 4 times that it says sukkah. That would teach us that you need 4 walls, except that we do need one word sukkah to teach us just in general that you need to dwell in a sukkah. So one of them is not extra. So we got 3 extras. One is needed for the regular law of sukkah. The other 3 are extras. So that teaches us that you need 3 walls for a sukkah. What is the 3 walls? How does it? How do you come to? How does it work? So you have 3 walls. 2 of them are the regular size walls, and the third wall could be a tefach size, a handbreadth. That would be good enough. So again, we're learning from the verse that you need 3. And halacha l'Moshe Sinai, the tradition from Moses, teaches us that the third one could be fulfilled with just a handbreadth. And now Reb Shimon says that it's not about how it's spelled and transmitted, it's the way how it's pronounced. And Reb Shimon ends up, each word, sukkah, sounds plural. The way it's pronounced is plural. So you got 2, 4, 6, because each word basukais is plural. So each one equals 2. So if you have 3 sukkaises, that equals 6 times sukkah. Now, one of the words sukkais you really need because it has to say it to tell you the law of dwelling in a sukkah. So therefore, you'll really only have 2 basukaises that are extra. And if you only have 2 basukaises that are extra, so you end up with 4 sukkais, 4 words sukkais. In other words, 2 plurals equals 4 sukkah. That would mean that you need 4 walls. And if you need 4 walls, that's how Reb Shimon says, that's the 4th wall. The Halacha Moshe Sinai says it could be a tefach, but you need 4. So that would be his way of coming to that conclusion that you really need 4, because he's basically, it all boils down to the fact that he's emphasizing the way it's pronounced instead of the way it's written. And that would be the machloikis, that would be the basis for this argument between the rabbis and Reb Shimon. But then the Gemara says, but there's different ways, other ways of possibly understanding it. The Gemara gives a few other options. What are the other options? So the Gemara says, if you want, you could say another explanation of this argument. Everyone holds it that we go by the mikra, the way it's pronounced. But the question is, do you need a source for the schach? So according to the rabbis, the 4th word basukah emphasizes schach, that there needs to be schach. And so you have 1 for schach and 3 for walls. According to Reb Shimon, you don't need a source for schach, because obviously a sukkah means schach. And therefore, you only need to teach you about the walls. And if it says it 4 times, that means that you need 4 walls. So that would be the reason why Reb Shimon holds 4 walls. The rabbis would say, no, 3 is enough, because one of the walls you're using, one of the words sukkah, you're using for schach. So you really only have 3 extras. Those 3 would teach you need 3 walls and not 4. So that would be the source of the argument, the basis of the argument, the rabbis and Reb Shimon. That's the second option. Then comes the third option. And the third option is everyone holds Yeshem Lamasidus. And the way that it is written is the most important way of expounding. And the argument is that you have 3 words that you can expound upon. So that teaches you 3 walls. Now comes the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And the question between Reb Shimon and the rabbis is, what is the halacha l'Moshe Sinai teaching us? Is it teaching us to add a wall, that you need a 4th wall? A tefach is good enough, but it needs to be a 4th wall, a tefach? Or is it saying subtract from your 3rd wall, and that wall that you need, it doesn't have to be a full-fledged wall, even a tefach is good enough. So is the halacha Moshe Sinai coming to be machmir, to add on a chumrah, or is it coming to subtract and tell you that and give you a kula, a leniency in your 3rd wall? So again, everyone would agree, Yeshem L'Masidus, that we're following the way it is written. And if the way it's written, it comes out that there's 4 sukkahs. One of them you need for the rule of sukkah, that you need to dwell in a sukkah. So there's 3 extras. And the question is, what is the halacha l'moshe Sinai coming? The Torah is telling you need 3 walls. Halacha l'moshe Sinai is coming to add a 4th wall, or maybe it's coming to subtract the 3rd wall from being a full-fledged wall. So that was a 3rd option. And then came the 4th option, and that was everyone holds that the halacha l'moshe Sinai is coming to subtract. But the question is, do you need to are you able to use the verse that is telling you the general law of sukkah? Can you expound on that word as well also? So in addition to the fact that it's telling you need to dwell in a sukkah, can you use that once you're having the other words sukkah that are extra and you're expounding on them? Can you also expound on the initial word as well? And the Hebrew term for that is darshan techilos. Can you darshan the original word for sukkah as well? And that would be the argument. The Reb Shimon says you could darshan it, and therefore you have an extra wall. You've got a 4th wall. Of course, halacha l'moshe Sinai is coming to subtract, so the 4th wall doesn't have to be a full-fledged 4th wall, but it needs to be a tefach. According to the rabbis, that you cannot use an extra word sukkah that's already being used for the teaching you that you need to dwell in a sukkah. So you only have really 3 extra words sukkah. And halacha l'moshe Sinai comes and tells you it doesn't have to be full 3 walls, that the 3rd wall could be only a tefach. And that was 4 ways of explaining it. And then the Gemara ended off that there could be another explanation of Reb Shimon, and it has to do with the fact that he's learning from a pasuk in Yeshaya, which we've quoted this pasuk before. And there the pasuk mentions about sukkah being protection from zerem and matar, which means from a storm and from a rain. And if you understand it that way, it comes out that the sukkah really needs a 4th wall because it's supposed to be protecting us from rain and from the stormy rains. And basically, you would need 4 walls. Of course, the rabbis, the commentaries all ask, what are you learning a halacha from a book of prophets? We learn halacha from the Chumash. But divrei Torah and divrei Kabbalah lo yalfinon, it says we're not supposed to learn halachas from the book of prophets. So on that, you have the common answer that he's not really learning a halacha. He's learning it's a giloi milsa bialma. He's just revealing what the concept of sukkah really is. That a sukkah has to be from zerem and matar, and therefore mechsa mistar, it has to be a protection, and as Rashi brings that since it says mechsa mistar without the 4th wall, it's not going to be a protection from zerem, from the storm, and because the wind will go into that wall that's open, and therefore you need a 4th wall according to Reb Shimon.
Question, Rabbi.
Yes.
Were there storms when Bnei Israel were covered by the Ananei HaKavod? And if so, I can understand the
Connection.
The point here about the 4th wall, but in the desert, there was no rain, no storms. So therefore, why even bring in this explanation? Because if the sukkah is supposed to represent what was happening to Bnei Israel when they were traveling through the desert, then make the drasha based upon the situation as it existed.
Well, that's an interesting point. You could explain that the fact is that the word sukkah is supposed to protect from these things. So even though you want to say that maybe the sukkahs that they dwelled in, maybe did not protect or weren't made of protection, which is definitely unclear because it was Hashem's cloud and there were no storms to know if it would have protected from a storm or not. So the bottom line is that you could say it would have protected had there been a storm, or you could say that there were no storms, so it wasn't really a protection from it. But however you learn, Reb Shimon seems to say that we do need to fit within the rule of whatever sukkah means. And if sukkah means that it protects you from the rain and from the storm, so according to Reb Shimon, that's what a sukkah is. It's commemorating the clouds of glory, true, but it has to. But the Torah says in order to commemorate, you got to dwell in a sukkah. So even if even if it's not exactly the same makeup of the sukkah that the clouds, but it has to be a sukkah. That's the term used. So the fact that it's not exactly the same is it's an interesting point that you're making. But I mean, I would still see where Reb Shimon is coming from. That the fact is, it uses the word sukkah. Now, even in addition to that, the fact is that they didn't have the storm in the desert, assumingly, and even if their sukkah wouldn't have protected them from it, the fact is they didn't have that. So you could also say that our sukkah has to make us feel similar to how we felt in the desert, even though maybe the walls didn't protect them from the rain and the storms. But the fact is they didn't have those storms. So we need our sukkah to commemorate how we felt then, not to commemorate the walls of the Anani Kavod, but to commemorate the feeling inside the Anani Kavod. So maybe that is, you know what I mean? That also would be a connection to the Anani Kavod of not having the storm.
But
So
Rabbi, the
yes.
only discussions that appears is about whether or not the schach provides more shade than allows the sun to come in. That's the only element that is ever discussed. It's the only element ever discussed. Nobody discusses rain. Nobody discusses anything else. The rain and everything else that's brought in after the fact from Hosea. Nobody discusses up to that point about rain. So if you wanted to say, okay, the sukkah is supposed to prevent to stop the situation with the sun, okay, I can understand that because that is discussed, but rain was not.
So I think if you want to reword, I see your question. I think if I'm understanding it right, I would word it like this: that the sukkah is meant that rain could fall in. We're not supposed to have a sukkah that can't get that doesn't allow rain. So how is Reb Shimon learning from the end part of this pasuk about the sukkah being a protection from rain if it really isn't a protection from rain? I think that would maybe be a strong question because we discussed it earlier when we brought this pasuk, and we said that the main thing that we were learning there is about the sail part of it, that we're learning from the sukkah being sail. Now that fits very well because the sukkah, that we're learning regarding sukkah is all about the shade, and the rain part is not exactly does not exactly fit Hilchos Sukkah. So I think that maybe is a good question. Is that more or less what you're asking? That in other words, it's not about the rain, it's about the shade. That was what I understood from your question. Right? Is that along the lines?
Yes. I mean, in terms of we discuss more about shade and the sun and everything else when we discuss the sukkah and how tall it is, etc. But nobody in the discussions of how tall or whatever it is ever says, oh, and we do it this way because of the rain, because everybody realizes that it doesn't matter whether it's tall or short or whatever it is, your schach is not going to prevent the rain from falling into your
Sukkah.
your
And it's not
sukkah.
allowed to. If it would, then it's more like a house, right? We need to be able, it needs to be able to fall through.
Okay, so why even bring in this
So
discussion?
that deserves to be asked. I'm going to have to look up in the commentaries and see. I think it's a good question about what the opinion of Reb Shimon, how he how he would hold about that and how he's learning from the end part of the pasuk. What I want to do is also look back and see where we spoke about that, because I remember the discussion about the end part of the pasuk that we're not really we didn't really connect it earlier to the sukkah. We really connected the first part of the pasuk to the sukkah. So I want to look back at that Gemara maybe and then see if the commentaries mention anything. It's good. I think it's a good question. So in any event, so we have this opinion of Reb Shimon that maybe again it's we're trying to figure out what Reb Shimon's source is, and this is Rav Masna thinks that the source of Reb Shimon is from this pasuk, and that he finds that this would be a source to have four walls. And even with this source, it is interesting because there's a halacha l'maisha Sinai that tells you that the fourth wall doesn't have to be a full wall. Even a tefach is good enough. So that halacha l'maisha Sinai almost like ruins this whole concept. Why does he want a fourth wall? Because the pasuk says a sukkah really is something that protects you from rain. Oh, really? It protects you from rain? Well, halacha Moshe Sinai tells me that you don't need that fourth wall. So what ends up happening is you sort of have the idea, the purpose, the mission of having these four walls was trying to fit with this pasuk, but then comes the halacha Moshe Sinai and tells you that you don't really need the fourth wall. Well, what about the rain? I thought we're supposed to protect us from rain. So it sounds like is that Reb Shimon, according to the way we're understanding it now, Reb Masna's path of his explanation is that sukkah is meant to really protect from rain. And maybe that would also mean the roof as well. However, Halacha Moshe Sinai comes and tells you that the fourth wall doesn't have to be a full-fledged wall. Once the Halacha Moshe Sinai knocks off the fourth wall from being a full-fledged wall, maybe that's where we remove this concept of thinking that it's going to protect you from rain, as if that's the main thing. In other words, it's not about protecting you from rain anymore. It's about how many walls you need. You do need a fourth wall, similar to protection from rain, but it's enough only a tefach, meaning we're not expecting you to have a protection from rain with a sukkah. So in other words, it could be the halacha Moshe Sinai, according to Reb Shimon, is what gives us the ability to have a new understanding of the strach. That let me mute everybody. So possibly the answer to your question is the fact that the halacha l'moshe Sinai is removing the understanding of being protection from rain. In other words, you need a wall similar to what a sukkah is meant for, but the fact is even a tefach is good enough because a sukkah is not meant to be protection fully from rain. In other words, that's what the halacha Moshe Sinai is coming to tell you. It's a thought. I'm just sharing the thought, Ezra, that maybe would answer it. But I'll have to take a look and see if any commentaries bring this up, and also look back at the other Gemara where we spoke about this pasuk. Okay, now the Gemara continued and said, where do you put this extra tefach? So you're going to have a third wall, or according to Reb Shimon, the fourth wall. Where do you put that tefach, that hand breadth for your third wall? So the simple understanding was Rav's understanding. You just put it right there. You have an L shape of two walls perpendicular to each other. At the end of one of them, which is called Keneged Hayotze, by the exit of those two walls, either one, you put an extra little handbreadth of a wall, a board. That's where you put it. This is Rav. Rav says, stick it there. And then we had Rav Kahana, Rav Asi saying, what about the Rosh Tor? What about the beginning of a row, of a line? Rashi says similar to the way they used to plant. They would it would get smaller and smaller, and so the way or it would start off small and get bigger and bigger, I guess you would say. And so the example that's given on page 7a, in many of the Gemaras, it has a little picture over there, would be sort of like an L shape, and then it has a diagonal, almost like a triangle. And that would be one way of understanding Rashi. There's a debate exactly what Rashi really means. He does the way it's written is a little vague, but one understanding is that it's sort of like a triangle, and the logic behind it, which Rashi does spell out, that it looks like four walls, meaning it looks enclosed. That if you have the tefach diagonal instead of straight, if that extra handbreadth of the third wall is more of a diagonal, it looks like it's enclosing the area more. If it would be straight, it doesn't look as much like it's enclosing the area. But if it's diagonal, so it looks like it's enclosing the area. So this was their idea to Rav. Don't you think that would be better? Now Rav was quiet. And again, Rav being quiet is definitely deserves thought. Why was he quiet? Was he disagreeing? Was he agreeing? There is a concept of shtika k'hoida. If you're quiet, it means you agree. There's also possibility that he was quiet because he controlled himself from answering back. There is a vart that Rav is in the Zohar is Reb Abba. Rav is a Kabbalist. And Rav had an answer over here, Al Pi Kabbalah, which is called Nistar. He had an answer that was based on the secrets of the Torah. And he didn't want to say it because he didn't want to reveal to the people who are not into Kabbalah the secrets of the Torah. And therefore he was Shasik Rav, he was quiet, meaning he had what to say, but it was Al Pi Nistar. It was according to the secrets of the Torah, not according to the revealed part of the Torah. And therefore, Rav was quiet. It's interesting, Rav is known for a number of statements in the Gemara about not using words, not talking too much. A person should be very careful of how they speak, and even teaching your student, you should speak in short. Don't be long-winded. Different Gemaras about Rav and how he was sort of like reserved, and he wasn't didn't really overuse his power of speech. So that's another point to mention here about Rav. Rav was quiet. But in any event, the commentaries do debate what if Rav agreed or disagreed with this idea of the Rosh Tor, the diagonal. Now there is another way of opinion of how Rashi understands the Rosh Tor that it's a little different than we just explained, and it has to do with a sort of like a diagonal hole of a tefach, a handbreadth, but in the middle of the third wall of the triangle. Some of you may have a picture of it, but that's another way of understanding the Rosh Tor of what their opinion was. That make it like a triangle, and stick this third wall, which is a very small part of the third wall, stick it as in the middle of where that third wall of the triangle would be. And that would, instead of on the side, like I explained until now, another opinion of the way what the Gemara means here and what Rashi means is that it's really in the middle of that third wall. In any event, this was a question that was asked. Now, Itmar Nami in the Gemara then says it was said this was also stated in the by that Shmuel said this in the name of Levi about that you put it like Rav said by the exit of those two walls. So we're talking about an L-shaped sukkah. You have an L shape, and then you need the third wall. That third wall goes by either of the ends of the two other walls. That would be Rav's view, and that would be Shmuel's view in the name of Levi. That you put it Keneged HaYotze, and that's the similar. That is the Meirin Bei Medrasha. That's the way they paskin in the base Medrash. And you put it Keneged HaYotze. So we've got Rav, we've got Shmuel, and Levi. That's basically how the third wall should be. And then we have an opinion that says, no, that third wall has certain rules about it. And this we have this view is Rab Simon, and some say it's Rab Shub ben Levi, that where do you put that final third wall, which is a small bar the size of a hand breath, where do you stick it? So Rab Simon or Rab Shub ben Levi, they say, no. First of all, it's a little more than a tefach. It's a tefach soichik. Soichik literally means laughter. When you laugh, your mouth, your lips spread apart. And so the tefach is soichik. It's a spread apart tefach. It means your fingers are not tight. A tefach, a hand breath, normally is your fingers are tight together, your four fingers. Tefach soichek is they're spread out. So you got a little extra space. It's a little more than a tefach. Now you got to take this extra, a little more than a tefach board, and you got to put it within or close to the end of 3 hand breaths from one of the walls. So there's a whole procedure how this has to be done. If you want to rely on the most simplest sukkah, the least amount of walls in your sukkah, you need to know all the technical rules. Rav Simon and Rav Shmuel Levi add some technical details to how you got to do it. If you want to make this the simplest sukkah, 2 walls and a third wall is a tefach, but you got to follow the qualifications over here. So they qualify it. You can have it, but let me just tell you how it has to be. You got to put it within 3 tefachim, 3 hand breaths of one of those 2 walls. It's got to be a little more than a tefach, a little more than a hand breath. And the reason why this works is because you have a little less than 3 hand breaths space, which is called lavud, means it's considered like it's attached to the wall. Then you have this tefach soichek, this little bigger than a hand breath board. So altogether, if you add 2.9 plus 1.1, you have 2.9 empty space. I'm using 2.9 hand breaths, a little less than 3 hand breaths, well, 2.9 hand breaths. Then you got 1.1 hand breath of a solid wall. So altogether, 2.9 and 1.1 plus 1.1 equals 4. Now you have a 4 hand breath wall. What do you mean? It's only 1.1 hand breaths. Yeah, but there's a halachic rule called lavud that considers the other 2.9 empty space as if it's filled in. So you got 2.9 plus 1.1, you got a 4 hand breath wall. And how much is a wall need to be? A wall needs to be 7 hand breaths. That's what we learned before, Beis Shammai. However, you have majority. You have a 4 hand breath wall. You now have majority of a wall because 4 is majority of 7. And the halacha l'Moshe Sinai says that you can rely on all these leniencies. You got 1 tefach, you got lavud, and you got the majority of a wall. So altogether, that makes it kosher for the third wall. This won't work for the first wall or the second wall, but it works for the third wall. That you have these leniencies, and altogether you add it up, and it'll work. Now the question is, do you really need 4 handbreadths to make majority of 7? What about 3.6? Why do you need 4 to be majority of 7? 3.6 is already the majority of 7. So why do you need your tefach soichek? Why do you need it to be a expanded tefach handbreadth? Let it just be a regular handbreadth. They have 1 handbreadth, you have 3.9 empty space, and now you have 2.9 empty space plus 1 handbreadth is 3.9. Is 3.9 the majority of 7? Yes. So why isn't that good enough? What do you need 4? Why do you need a tefach soichek, a tefach, a handbreadth that's stretched out, that's spread out a little to make it 4? So you have 2.9 plus 1.1 and make it 4. To make it majority, you don't need 4 to be majority. 3.6 would already be majority. And you have much more than that. Because if you have a 2.9 empty space, and then you have a 1 tefach, regular tefach, not a soichek tefach, a 1 tefach, then 1 plus 2.9 is 3.9. That's majority of 7. So the commentaries ask this question. And they say that, yeah, in addition to needing majority of 7, there's one more thing you need. And that is you need it to be significant. 4 handbreadths is a significant size. Less than 4 handbreadths is not significant. So we're relying on this 4th wall, and we've got a halacha l'meisha misinai that says a tefach is good enough, but we've got these rabbis, Rabbi Simon, and some say Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that give us they qualify how it has to be. And what ends up coming out from this is it's got to actually be somehow calculated to be 4 handbreadths, the majority of 7. And in order to do that, you got to place it within 3 handbreadths of the wall. And this way you follow, you have the law of Levi, which means it's considered like it's attached to the wall. You have the majority of 7 handbreadths, which makes it considered like a sukkah wall. And you have 4 handbreadths together with the law of Levi. It's considered like it's 4 handbreadths, and that makes it that it's significant to be a wall. And these all are in order to make this wall a kosher wall for the sukkah. Now, this seems to argue on the previous view. Rav and Shmuel and Levi, they seem to hold, Shmuel said it in the name of Levi, that they seem to hold that you don't need this whole thing. 1 tefach is good enough. That means you don't need the Levid law. You don't need the majority of 7 law. You don't need it to be significant for handbreadths. You don't need all that. So the understanding of the commentaries is that according to the halacha l'meisha misinai, 1 handbreadth, you could put it at the end and it's good enough. That's the biblical law. However, the rabbinic law on top of that, according to Reb Simon and Reb Yeshua ben Levi, is that you need additional rules in order to make this look more like a sukkah. Meaning, according to halacha, it's kosher. But these rabbis held that there's a rabbinic decree that there has to be more of an enclosed area, and in order to do that, you need to follow these extra rules of having tefach that's within 3 handbreadths of the wall, but not close to it, not close to the wall. It has to be a little away, but not too far away, because 3 handbreadths would be too far. But a little less than 3 handbreadths, maybe 2.9 would be perfect. And then you have your wall that's the size of a tefach, a little above a tefach soichek, a tefach that's expanded, and it's like a little more loose. And that means a handbreadth that's more loose would be like 1.1, we'll call it a tefach. So 2.9 plus 1.1, you have 4 handbreadths. that is considered your wall. It's majority of 7. It's significant in its own right because 4 is considered a significant amount. That makes it a kosher third wall. Okay, now comes the new Gemara. Amar Rav Yehuda. We're going to start here on page 7a. Amar Rav Yehuda. And let me tell you where we're up to. We are 7 lines, I think, or 8 lines from the top. Let's see. 7 lines from the top of the page. There's a dot in the Gemara. On page 7a, 7 lines from the top. If you are in the art scroll, we are 7a, 7a1, the bottom of the first column. Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said, Sukkah ha'asuya kemav keshera. A sukkah made like an alley is kosher, which is different than we've been understanding until now. Until now, we learned that you need 2 walls in L shape. What would happen if you have 2 walls that are parallel to each other and not touching each other? That's called a mavui, an alley. Because an alley, well, there are 2 types of alleys. You could have a open alley on both sides or an open alley on one side. This is getting us into Eruvin language. But the alley that we're talking about is open on both sides. And so you have 2 walls that are parallel to each other. So let's say you have these 2 walls that are parallel to each other. How does it work, this third wall? Because we've just concluded that a third wall is kosher to be a tefach, even if it's only a handbreadth. Okay, we had Reb Simon and Reb Yeshua ben Levi that it can't be a regular handbreadth, a little bigger than a handbreadth. Okay, and it has to be in a certain place. But how does that affect? How does it impact it if the 2 walls are not next to each other? So Rav Yehuda comes along and says, a sukkah that's made like a mavoi, that's these 2 parallel walls, it's kosher. It's a kosher sukkah. Well, I say tefach on that third wall that you need, and that's kosher with the tefach. We have a halacha l'maisha misinai about the third wall. You know what? Ma'amidai l'chol ruach sheyirtzeh. You stick it whichever side you want. You have these 2 parallel walls. Guess what? You want to stick it at the end of one wall? No problem. You want to stick it at the other end of that wall? No problem. You want to stick it at the other wall, the end of it? No problem. The other end of that wall? You got 4 options of where to stick this third wall. You have 4 options where to stick it. Which wall do you want? Which end of the wall do you want to stick it? Because when you have 2 walls, you have 4 ends of walls. And you can stick this extra tefach by any of them. Now, we got Rav Simon here again. And Rav Simon, Rav Yeshua ben Levi Amar, Rav Simon, and some say Rav Yeshua ben Levi says, also like pas arba. You have to make for this sukkah a pas, a wall, arba'a of 4 handbreadths, umashahu, and a little, 4 plus. Umamidai bepachas mishleisha, and you put it within 3 handbreadths, samach l'daifen, near one of those 2 walls. B'chol pachas mishleisha samach l'daifen, and every time that you have something closer than the 3 handbreadths to the wall is kalavadami, is like it's attached. And what you end up having is, let's say, you have 2.9 empty space of 2.9 handbreadths of empty space. You have 4.1 handbreadths of a wall. And that 2.9 plus 4.1 equals 7. So now you have a 7 handbreadth wall. Now, we didn't say exactly this type of thing, for the other situation where you have an L-shaped sukkah. Because when you have the L-shaped sukkah, we said one tefach is good enough. In majority of 7 handbreadths is good enough. And how do you have majority of 7 handbreadths? You have 1 tefach, a little extra than a tefach, and it's put next to an empty space of 2.9 tefachs handbreadth. And 1.1 plus 2.9 equals 4. And that's a majority of 7, and that was good enough. Now we're saying, no, you need 4.1 handbreadths of solid, because we're talking about a different case. We're talking about 2 walls that are parallel to each other. So now you need to make a third wall. And this third wall is not going to touch the other end, but it's going to be considered kosher because you're going to be 7 handbreadths. So it's not touching the third wall. There are 2 walls here that are, this is very interesting because really, physically, none of the walls are touching. Physically, none of the walls are touching. You have 2 parallel walls, obviously not touching. And you have a third wall that's 2.9 handbreadths away from one of the walls. It's even further away from the other wall. So it's not touching either of the 2 walls, this third wall. So we got none of the walls are touching each other. And this is going to be a kosher sukkah. We are a little more strict. This wall can't just be a tefach. It has to be 4 handbreadths. And not even 4. It has to be a little more than 4. Why does it have to be a little more than 4? Well, because it's you want to have 7. You want to have 7 handbreadths. How are you going to get 7 handbreadths? You're counting the empty space between this and one of the walls, and that empty space has to be maximum 2.9 handbreadths, maximum. So if you have 2.9 handbreadths and you want to get to 7, you need this wall to be at least 4.1. 2.9 plus 4.1 equals 7. You want it a little more, no problem. But it's got to be at least 7. How do you have 7? Well, it's 4.1 handbreadths physically. And the halachic law called lavud makes it into a connection to the wall that's there. So you can add those handbreadths to make it considered a wall that's not only 4 handbreadths, but it's even considered 7 because we're attaching it. We're using lavud to add on to these 2.9 empty space. The handbreadths to be considered as if they're attached. It's attached to the wall, and now you have a third wall. So you've got a very interesting sukkah here, and it's actually kosher. You've got a kosher sukkah. So if you want to surprise people in your neighborhood, you could maybe build a sukkah like this, and people will walk around and say, "What? You know, that's a sukkah?" Yes, you got a kosher sukkah over here. You got 2 parallel walls. You've got this third wall that looks a little strange. It's not touching either of the walls, and somehow this is going to be a kosher sukkah. We're calling it, and this is a machmir one because according to the earlier opinion, Rav Yehuda, he says, no, you know what? You just stick 1 tefach next to the wall and you're all set. So he was even more lenient. But this is, you want to be more strict, at least according to halacha, this is brought down. In halacha, you got to have 4 handbreadths, a little over 4 handbreadths, and that would be considered a kosher sukkah. Okay, but the Gemara says, but why is this? Why can't we follow the same logic? If there's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, if there's a halacha given to Moses at Sinai that 1 handbreadth is good enough, we should apply it here, like Rav Yehuda said. Why is Rav Simon and Rav Yeshua ben Levi making so complicated? It's a little over 4 handbreadths, and you have to put it in a certain place. One handbreadth is good enough. That's what you said before. And okay, you want to put it next to the 2.9 at the 2.9 mark? Okay, put it. But why do you need 4? 1 should be good enough. Why are you changing the law about the 1 tefach, which is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai? Why all of a sudden are you saying you need 4? So the Gemara says, why is this different? There you said 1 tefach that's a little expanded tefach. That was good enough. Why over here is it different to Ka'amrit that you said, boy, pas arba, that you need a wall that is 4 handbreadths plus a little extra. So the Gemara answers, Hasam The ika shtei defanos kihil chasan. Over there, you have two walls, kihil chasan. Now it's interesting that it's using this term. What we're now doing is changing the meaning of what does kihil chasan mean. Before we said kihil chasan means like the law that it needs to be 7 handbreadths. That was what kihil chasan meant. Now we're saying no, it also means that they have to be next to each other. Two walls that are kihil chasan that are next to each other, and there's no empty space in between them, meaning they're perpendicular walls. If you have two walls that are perpendicular, they're kihil chasan. They fit with the rules. So sagile betefach soiche. It's enough to have a tefach, a handbreadth that is a little expanded, and you can fit that halacha l'meisha b'sinai, and it makes it a kosher sukkah. Hacha, but here the leka shtei defanos, you don't have two walls next to each other. Ika pasar ba, if you have this wall that's a little over 4 handbreadths in, that's good. Ila, if not, then loy, then it's not good. It's not a kosher sukkah. Now, one of the commentaries mentions over here as well this idea that really one tefach should be good enough, according to the halacha l'meisha b'sinai. This is only rabbinic. That rabbinically you need to have this extra 4 whole spiel over here. You need 4 plus a little, 4.1, let's say, of a wall, because otherwise it looks like it doesn't have a third wall. Okay, so this is the meaning that the L-shaped sukkah looks a lot more like a sukkah than the parallel wall sukkah, and you need to do a little more to make it kosher, to make it look kosher. Now comes the next Gemara. The next Gemara is a little confusing. Rava says something, and the question is exactly how he said it. There's 3 ways of understanding what he said. We're not exactly sure what the wording he used. So this is here are the 3 statements that one of them was said by Rava. We're not exactly sure which. Amar Rava. Rava said, Ve'ena niteres ela betzuras hapesach. It is not permissible only if you have a tzuras hapesach, a tzura, a form of an entrance. You need to have a form of an entrance to make this permissible. Now, what is Rava talking about? Rava's talking about that we just said that you can have a tefach for your third wall. Okay. Rava says, yeah, but you know what? It's not as simple as you think. It's not kosher just having a tefach there. You need to make a tzuras hapesach to make that third wall kosher. So now it's getting more complicated. You know, sometimes you think, oh, it's simple, third wall, it's halacha l'meisha b'sinai. Not exactly. We initially thought that 1 tefach is good enough. But here you have, it has to be within a certain amount, it has to be a tefach soichek, and you know, and then it depends if it's it wasn't simple. Even if you have a majority of 7, it's not enough. It has to equal to 4. In order to make it a significant amount. Now comes Rava and says, and guess what? It's only permissible if you have a tzuras hapesach. You need to actually have a form of a opening. What does a form of an entrance mean? It means you got 2 beams on the side and 1 on top. That's an entrance. 2 side beams, one beam on top. Now, how does this fit with what we said before about a tefach, that you need a tefach? So Rava seems to be arguing about that whole concept of a tefach. And he says, yeah, you need a tefach, but not the way you understood it. You know how the tefach needs to be? The tefach needs to be that you have a half a tefach beam on this side, a half a tefach beam on the other side, and a beam on top. That's what it means. The third wall could be a tefach. Do you have a wall there? No. Do you have a tzuras pesach? Yes. A tzuras pesach. And what's the special law about this tzuras pesach? It needs to have a tefach altogether of wall. That third wall, it's not enough to make a tiny little PVC pipe or something, that's or a little a copper pipe, to put on as your tzuras pesach, as your beam that you're going to make the form of your entrance. You need to have a thick, even maybe a 2x4, according to some, would be good enough, because a 2x4 is 3.5 inches. Believe it or not, as much as we claim to be honest, when you go buy wood, a 2x4 is not 2 inches by 4 inches. It's 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches, if I'm not mistaken. And so if you use a 2x4, according to some opinions, that will be considered a half. Well, I'm sorry. It'll be for sure good. It's more than half. It's more than half a tefach, according to all opinions. So yeah, actually, if you use a 2x4, you're all set, because a 2x4 might be less than a tefach, but together with the other 2x4 on the other side, altogether it'll definitely be more than a tefach. And then you put something on top, you're all set. You have a tefach. How big of a wall do you have on your third wall? Your third wall is minimally a handbreadth, because you got two 2x4s. You need it to be at least a tefach. If you have two 2x4s, you're all set. You have at least a tefach. Even if you have less, according to some opinions, will be good. Even if 2x2, I don't know if it would work. No. A 2x3. If you have a 2x3, according to some, you have a 2x3 on one side, a 2x3 on the other. So two 2x3s, that would be that would also be a tefach, according to some opinions. So you might be able to get away with a 2x3 on each side, because altogether that side has a tefach. Is your tefach touching each other? No. You got one tefach, one half a tefach at one beam, the other half a tefach at the other beam, and you got something on top connecting the two, but they are not touching. And that is considered, according to Rava, the third wall. The third wall, it's not a solid wall, it's an empty wall, but it does have a frame. It's got a wooden frame. That's the first opinion of Rava, that's the meaning of the third wall having a tefach, contrary to everything we've said until now. Until now, we've said you need to have a solid one tefach. Now Rava comes and changes it and says, no, a half a tefach each side with something on top, and put it right next to the other wall. You don't put it within 3. You can put it right next to the other wall. You don't need this whole spiel with love it and all that. Now comes the next Ika de Amri. Some say that Rava said it a little differently. Amar Rava said, V'niteres nami b'tzuras hapesach. Rava says, everything you learned until now is good, but there's also an alternative option. Not that you need it to be this way. You could do what we said until now. But if you want, you could also have a tzuras hapesach that you could have if you put these two, you make a form of an entrance, it'll also be a kosher third wall. Now, according to this way we're understanding it, there's no minimum size. The tefach is good the way we explained it until now. If you want, you don't have to use a tefach. You could just use the alternative way is not use a tefach way of building a third wall. Use the tzuras hapesach option. The form of an entrance is also called a third wall. You have a tefach, that's halacha Moshe Sinai with the laws of Sukkah, that works. Then you have the law of tzuras hapesach, that could also be a kosher option for a third wall. Ika de Amri, and some say a third way that Rava said this law. Utzricha nami tzuras hapesach. You also need a tzuras hapesach in addition to the way we understood until now that you need a tefach. That's true, but you also need something else. So according to the third way of Rava, you got to be really strict. You're trying to get away with murder and we keep on adding new qualifications. Yeah, you got the tefach. It's got to be it's a little away from the wall. You got to make sure it measures a little more than a tefach. All these new, and guess what? It also needs to have a tzuras hapesach, an entranceway, which means that your third wall is going to end where the other wall ends. It's not just a tefach, and it's not just 2.9 inch handbreadths away from the wall. It's 2.9 handbreadths away. You got a tefach soichik, which is a little over a tefach, and then you have from that area to the end of the wall where it should be. You also need to have an entranceway of another type of beam with something on top, and that would be considered a kosher sukkah. So now we've got three ways of Rava either changing the halacha, giving an alternative to the halacha, or adding on to the halacha. Three ways of something that Rava said, which we're not exactly sure how Rava said. Okay, we're going to stop here. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rob.